Shalom, shalom. It's Brother Atazadat, Hero Israel. It's Galatians Chapter 4 breakdown. Giving all honor and glory to Yahweh Bashim Yahushai. Let's get right into it. It's Book of Galatians Chapter 4 and verse 1. And it reads, Now I say that the heir, as long as he is a child, differeth nothing from a servant, though he be Lord of all. Verse 2, but is under tutors and governors until the time appointed of the Father. Even so we, when we were children, were in the bondage under the elements of the world. So what this is essentially speaking on is the heir being the heir of the promises, according to what was promised through the Most High to Abraham through the seed of Isaac and Jacob, that child being in the nation of Israel. And Paul is using the wording of child because the Israelites, after leaving Egypt, were in a young stage. So this is in a time when Moses, the mediator, was appointing the law, statutes, and commandments to the Israelites after leaving Egypt. So this is what Paul is telling these Jews and these Gentiles in the book of Galatians. So let's go back to chapter 3 and verse 24. And it reads, Wherefore the law was our schoolmaster, to bring us unto Hamashiach, that we might be justified by faith. So again, like it says here and in verse 24, the law was a schoolmaster to the nation of Israel, which if you go over the previous video that I did, this is what Paul is touching on in chapter 3. He's explaining to these Galatians, these Jews and Gentiles, that the law is not what justifies you, neither faith alone, but those things go hand in hand. Let's go up to verse 12. And what he also touches on is the order of the promises given to Abraham, and how the law was introduced later on, and was by no means a justification, but it was for the nurturing and a bringing in of a better hope to the nation of Israel as they were entering the land of Canaan. And ultimately, when all nations are put under the subjection of Yahushai and the Israelites, because the law we're going to use, although it would be in our inward parts at that time, it will be used in a manner to judge righteous judgment amongst all nations of the earth. So again, this is what Paul is touching on in chapter 3. This is why he brings up the promises and the bringing in of the Gentiles, these Israelite foreigners, back into the fold, because all things started with the promise given to Abraham. So this Galatians, or actually let me read verse 11 and 12 and then go to verse 8. This is Galatians chapter 3 and 11. But that no man is justified by the law in the sight of God, it is evident, for the just shall live by faith. So again, faith is important, but also when you are executing the law, you show your works through the things that you believe, and those things, they start on the inside. This is what Paul is touching on, and he also touches on the same subject in Romans chapter 4. Slack, yeah. I know I'm going to a few different points, but just bear with me. This is book of Romans chapter 4 and verse 2. For if Abraham were justified by works, he had whereof to glory, but not before God. Verse 3. For what saith the scripture? Abraham believed God, and it was counted unto him for righteousness. So again, he was not justified by his works. First, he was justified through his belief, through leaving the land of his people under the direction of the Most High, and bringing him into the strange land, to the land of Canaan, and sojourning in a strange land. So again, he did all these things, and ultimately was instructed to offer up his only son, the heir to his generations to come after. So the Most High had commanded him to offer him up as a sacrifice, but this was all to try his faith, because again, the Most High does not put us in temptation, but tries our faith to see if we are found worthy and faithful as far as the things that are commanded and required of us. So again, Abraham was not justified through his work, but through his faith first, and he showed it through his works, and was found acceptable in his faith and his works, which is why he was given the commandment of circumcision, and ultimately was given the promises, which was to continue throughout his seed and throughout the generations of his seed. So again, this is why Paul says that faith is goes hand in hand with your works. So now let's go back to Galatians chapter 3 and verse 11. But that no man is justified by the law in the sight of God, for it is evident, the just shall live by faith. So again, Paul is saying that it's important to have faith. It's important to have faith, and also the law, although it's not the only thing that justifies you, it's also, the law was given for a reason. And it says in verse 12, and the law is not of faith, but the man that doeth them shall live in them. Because again, this was made and given for the perfecting of the nation of Israel, and for a better hope, which I touched on in the previous video. So this was all as a way of teaching the nation of Israel in the ways of righteousness, just in the ways of things that are justifiable in the eyes of the Most High as far as righteous works. And that goes along with your faith and your belief. So now let's go to verse 8. So this is what the previous chapter was touching on. Those that believed like Abraham believed, and giving them that justification through their belief. But now at this time of the Greeks and the Romans, these Israelite foreigners coming back into the fold, they were required to follow in the faith of Abraham and in his works, in following what was commanded to him and his seed, not just through the promise, which this is how these Israelite foreigners were this is how Paul is explaining to these Jews and these Gentiles that these Israelite foreigners are justified through the promise given through their forefather of these Jews and these Gentiles, which is the belief being justification, but also as they're being brought into the fold, their works, the works of the law, the righteous commandments, also as a means of showing their belief through their works. So it's Galatians chapter 3 and verse 8. And the scripture foreseeing that God would justify the heathen through faith, preached before the gospel unto Abraham, saying, in thee shall all nations be blessed. So again, the heathen that were justified through faith were these Israelite foreigners. And ultimately, all nations being blessed is speaking on the end times when the Yahweh Shai and ultimately under Yahweh Shai and under the Israelites, the whole earth would be put in subjection and also be judged righteously according to the righteous commandments that are in the law. Because these other nations will have to keep the law, and the law is perfect. But again, faith and works go hand in hand. So this is what Paul's touching on, and he goes into the promises and how the law was introduced later on this is for the building up of the nation of Israel. And we know ultimately, they would end up going off, because even Moses prophesied in the book of Deuteronomy. He said, after I pass away, you're going to go astray. So this is what Moses was saying, and it was also prophesied that not just through the law but through the prophets, the nation of Israel would go off, but they would be commanded to return to their former covenant and customs. So again, this is Paul is continuing in what he was touching on in chapter 3. So the sum of the matter is this: in chapter 3, Paul telling these Jews and Gentiles, these Galatians, telling them that they're not justified in the law because these Jews, these rulers of these Jews, they weren't justified because of their hypocrisy. And also they weren't justified in the works of the law because they're the precepts that are in the law and in the prophets that command the nation of Israel to return continuously. So what they did, these Jews, they had despised these Israelite foreigners and had outcasted them, although they were granted return not just through the law but through the prophets. And ultimately Yahweh Shai, he came to confirm the return of these Israelite foreigners back into the fold. And they really, it was already written in the law and the prophets. So they already knew these things. This is why Yahweh Shai, he had to come on the scene and rebuke these Jews for their hypocrisy. And this is ultimately why he got delivered up. This was because of envy, because they knew what they were doing was wrong. So That's essentially what Paul's touching on in chapter 3. That the law is not what justifies you. He also touches on how these Israelite foreigners are justified in returning to their former covenants through the promise given to Abraham and through his seed. And again, like I read here in Slovakia, verse 17. Well, actually, verse 17 also touches up on that too. But like I read in verse 24, the law was the schoolmaster to ultimately lead up to the times to after when these Israelites would go off and some would end up following these heathenish customs. So again, this is why in verse 24 it says the law was a schoolmaster to bring the nation into unification when Yahushua came on the scene. So it also says, Galatians Chapter 3 and 17, and this I say, that the covenant that was confirmed before of God in Hamashiach, the law which was 430 years after, cannot disannul, that it should make the promise of none effect. So the promise to Abraham is stood. And like I read in the previous video, the Most High confirmed it. He swore on himself. So again, this is how Paul is explaining to these Jews and these Gentiles how these Gentiles are justified, because the promises was never canceled out. And even the things commanded in the law, statutes, and commandments given after the nation of Israel had left Egypt. So this was all to come into play at a certain dispensation of time. The promises during the time of Abraham, and that passed down to the seed, the nation of Israel being brought up as a nation, nurtured in the land of Egypt, brought out of the land of Egypt, given the law, then as prophesied throughout the prophets, and also in the law that the Israel would go off. This is why Yahushua Mashiach was prophesied as that prophet that the nation of Israel would have to take heed to his commands in Deuteronomy 18. So all these things were already written first in the heavens, but in the earth they were had to be played out at a certain dispensation time. So again, this is what Paul is continuing on in chapter 4. So now let's go back to chapter 4, and we'll go back to verse 1. This book of Galatians chapter 4 and verse 1. Now I say that the heir, as long as he is a child, differeth nothing from a servant, though he be Lord of all, but is under tutors and governors, until the time appointed of the Father. Verse 3. Even so we, when we were children, were in bondage under the elements of the world. Verse 4. But when the fullness of the time was come, God sent forth his Son, made of a woman, made under the law. So the first three verses, that the child that Paul is speaking on is the nation of Israel in their early stage, after they had left Egypt and after when they were given the law. So the law being the tutors, and the governors being the prophets that were sent throughout that time to reprove, rebuke, and also prophesy of things to come to the nation of Israel. And this is why it's saying in verse 4, when the fullness of the time was to come, God sent forth his son. And that was in the time of the Romans and the Greeks, which was made under the law. Because if you go to the account of Luke, you know, John and Yahushua, you know, they were they came from righteous men and women, which followed the law, kept the precepts, kept the commandments. Verse 5, to redeem them that were under the law, that we might receive the adoption of sons. So the adoption of sons being these Israelite foreigners, commanded to return to their former covenants and customs. Because you had to have Yahushua to come on the scene and make that proclamation. And these Jews, the ruling Jews that ruled the multitude of the Jews, they were blind to the things that were written in the law. This is why Yahushua Mashiach, he had to come on the scene, rebuke them, confirm the promises to them, but also command the lost sheep of the house of Israel to return. And at the same time prophesying of the future destruction of Jerusalem. So now let's go back to Galatians chapter 3 and 19. This book of Galatians chapter 3 and verse 19. Wherefore then serveth the law, it was added because of transgressions, till the seed should come to whom the promise was made, and it was ordained by the angels in the hand of a mediator. So again, you know, the law was added to build up, reprove, and also show the nation of Israel in the early stages what things to abstain from, what is acceptable and justifiable in the eyes of the Most High, and what is abhorrible. This is what the law teaches you, and this is why it's good to keep the law. Because if you're led by the law, and you show the righteous works of the law through your faith, you can't go wrong. So this is how the nation of Israel was to be built up at that time. Now let's go back to actually, let me read verse 21. Is the law then against the promises of God? God forbid. So the law isn't against the promises, but it was added as a means to build up the nation of Israel, and ultimately, for the time from which they had went off, there was a time when they would ultimately, as written in the prophets and in the law, they would be commanded to return, the whole nation as a whole. So this is Galatians chapter 4 and verse 5. To redeem them that were under the law, that we might receive the adoption of sons. So again, all these things had to come to pass. So is Galatians chapter 4 verse 28. Now we brethren, as Isaac was, are the children of promise. So again, this is all through the promises of Abraham, the law being added as a means to build up the nation Israel in the early stage, and also for when the time to come when these Romans and these Greeks were to be over the nation Israel, you would ultimately have the law commanding those who had left their former covenants and customs to return. And also, this is why the prophets were continuously sent to the children of Israel. Now let's go to verse 6. And because ye are sons, God hath sent forth the Spirit of his Son into your hearts, crying, Abba, Father. Verse 7. Wherefore thou art no more a servant, but a son. And if a son, then an heir of God through Hamashiach. So the adoption of sons, this is what Paul is touching on also in verse 7. The adoption of sons being these Israelite foreigners, and also them being brought back into the fold. This is why Paul uses the terminology of adoption. Because again, and this is why Paul uses these type of examples, and why he brings up the promise, and then goes into why the law was introduced. And as you can see, he's following the timeline, like it says in chapter 3 and verse 17. Salakia. And this I say, that the covenant was confirmed before of God in Hamashiach. The law, which was 430 years after, cannot disannul, that it should make the promise of none effect. So again, the law being introduced as a means to build up the nation of Israel. And this is why Paul is saying in verse 1, chapter 4, the heir, the child, that's the nation of Israel, and him speaking on the nation of Israel in their early stages. So now let's go to verse 7. Wherefore thou art no more a servant, but a son, and if a son, then an heir of God through Hamashiach. Verse 8. Howbeit, when ye knew not God, ye did service unto them, which by nature are no gods. So as you can see, the subject that Paul is following up on is on verse 7 and the adoption of the sons, starting at verse 5. So verse 5 through 8, this is why it's important not just to go here a little, there a little, but also precept upon precept, line upon line. So this is talking about these Israelite foreigners who had been assimilated into Greek and Roman society. Verse 9, but now after ye have known God, or rather known of God, how turn ye again to the weak and beggarly elements, whereunto ye desire again to be in bondage. So now, this is the bondage that Paul is speaking on is the bondage of having to keep all the law and all the precepts in its entirety, which was never perfectly kept even after the nation Israel came out of Egypt, was given the precepts, the statutes, the laws, because again, you had things introduced like sacrificial law, which was to cover sins for when one was to go off. And I touched on this in the previous video. You had the law of sacrifice introduced as a means to cover for sins when one would go off. So Yahushai, as that living sacrifice, he was a took on a sacrifice of how one would offer up a sacrifice after they had committed a transgression. So again, that alone tells you that the law was never perfectly kept, but it was added for a bringing in of a better hope. So this is what Paul is speaking on about the uh, the um, the commandments of the law. Verse 10: Ye observe days and months and times and years. I am afraid of you, lest I have bestowed upon you labor in vain. Verse 12: Brethren, I beseech you, be as I am, for I am as ye are. Ye have not injured me at all. Because again, this is why Paul continuously says, be followers of me, even as I'm follower from Mashiach. Because Paul was learned in the law and in the prophets, and he followed the works that Yahushua Mashiach did when he came on the scene. So again, these works, these things were revealed through him, not just through the through what he had already he already knew from the law and the prophets, but also throughout his ministry. These are things that he had learned from those that were taught by Yahushua Mashiach. Peter, James, Barnabas, any of those people that he had contact with, which were under the apostles and the elders at Jerusalem. Because again, there were many witnesses to Yahushua Mashiach. Many people heard the teachings that he had. So of course, Paul, although he never met him in person, he caught wind of these parables and prophecies that Yahushua that he did speak of when he came on the scene. Verse 13: You know how through infirmity of the flesh I preached the gospel unto you at the first. And this is the same things that were taught by Yahushua Mashiach, and the things written in the law and the prophets, because that's the whole gospel. The law, the prophets, and what was taught through Yahushua Mashiach. Verse 14: And my temptation which was in my flesh ye despised not, nor rejected, but received me as an angel of God, even as Hamashiach Yahushua. Verse 15: Where is then the blessedness ye spake of? Or actually, let me go back to verse 13. Ye know how through infirmity of the flesh I preached the gospel unto you at the first. Verse 14: And my temptation which was in my flesh ye despised not, nor rejected, but received me as an angel of God, even as Hamashiach Yahushua. Verse 15: Where is then the blessedness ye spake of? For I bear you record that, if it had been possible, you would have plucked out your own eyes and have given them to me. Verse 16: Am I therefore become your enemy because I tell you the truth? So Paul here is saying in the to these Jews and these Gentiles, is he now become your enemy because he's telling you the things that these the rulers of the Jews neglected to inform to these Jews and these Israelite foreigners. So now let's bring out a precept in Galatians chapter 1, verse 10. And it reads, "For do I now persuade men or God? Or do I seek to please men? For if I yet pleased men, I should not be the servant of Hamashiach." Because when Hamashiach, Yahushua, came into the scene, he was speaking the truth. And he was despised because of that. Especially by the rulers of these Jews, because they enjoyed their lofty positions and also their seats in the synagogues and to be praised of men. Verse 17, or Slakia, Galatians 4 and 17. They zealously affect you, but not well. Yeah, they would exclude you that you might affect them. So again, this was the behaviors that these Jews in these high positions that were rulers under the multitudes of those in Judea. This was their mannerisms. They would exclude those that did not agree with them, nor their doctrines, nor their ways, which was ultimately their them promoting vanity, hypocrisy, and we're just looking to be worshipped as elders, as wise men. And Yahushua, he rebuked these Jews. Let's get the account in Luke chapter 11, verse 42. This is book of Luke chapter 11, verse 42. And it reads, "But woe unto you, Pharisees, for ye tithe mint and rue and all manner of herbs, and pass over judgment and the love of God. These ought ye to have done, and not to leave the other undone." So they were claiming to give alms. They did it in front of the multitudes of people. They had the crispy, white linen garments. They would make they would make prayer outside, and just a few examples that Yahushua spoke of. They claimed to keep the ceremonial laws to a T, ceremonial washings, but they neglected judgment and the love of God, and ultimately through the neglecting of these Israelite foreigners. This is why Yahushua, it had to take Yahushua to come on the scene and tell these Jews, look, I'm sent to justify all Israel, but I'm sent to the lost sheep, and the lost sheep, are commanded to return. This was a common theme in Yahushua's ministry. So these Pharisees, they were passing over judgment, and passing over judgment, that's speaking on leaving judgment. Like one says, well, I'll pass on that. They weren't committing judgment. Instead, they were doing the fleshly works of the law, which is the carnal washings, cleaning the cups, and those were just traditions that they had made on their own. The Corban tradition. So these men were hypocrites, and also, they were excluding those that it was very clear, and it's still clear today in the law and in the prophets, that these foreigners those that they were excluding were commanded to return. And this is why Yahushua had to come on the scene and justify those who had went off into these heathenish customs. And again, this is what Paul starts off in the verses 5 through 8. So essentially, this is what Galatians chapter 4 is about. Paul is going further into the history as far as the time that the law was given, the purpose of the law, and he also touches on this in Romans. That the law tells you what is justifiable, what are righteous works, what things to avoid, like adultery and stuff like that. So let's go back to Galatians chapter 4 and verse 17. So now let's just actually select here. Let's just go down to verse 1. So the heir of the child, that's the nation of Israel in their early stage. Tutors and governors being the law and the prophets, commanding the children of Israel, those who had went off, to return, and ultimately to provide the nation of Israel with the prophecies. This is why Paul, he constantly is quoting prophecy also. Like in chapter 3 and verse 8, saying all nations will be blessed. Now that hasn't came to pass yet. Same if you go back to Genesis chapter 22. Salakia, bear with me. And verse 17, that in blessing I will bless thee, and multiplying I will multiply thy seed as the stars of the heaven, and as the sand which is upon the seashore, and thy seed shall possess the gate of his enemies. So up until when it says that his seed would be as the stars of heaven and as the sand upon the seashore, ultimately that was in Deuteronomy chapter 1, that was fulfilled. But ultimately, that hasn't been fully fulfilled, this prophecy here. This is what you call a transitional prophecy. Because ultimately, just like Abraham, who basically almost offered up his only son, his only posterity, in the place of his faith. Ultimately, that's how 1/3 of our people, those who are being reproved, your faith is being tried. This is one of the transitional prophecies that will be given ultimately to the 1/3 of our people who remain faithful unto the things that are commanded and required of them. Because again, you have in the kingdom the 2/3, those who have to be reborn in the kingdom. The 1/3 are going to be multiplying through those 2/3 that have to be reborn in the kingdom. So again, this is a transitional prophecy, and this is why Paul he's constantly laying prophecies and hints here and there, that tells you who these Gentiles are, and also how he's lining the things that he's teaching with the things in the prophets. Now, he couldn't plainly come out and say all these things, because you got to remember, you had these the Romans. They were under the Romans at the time. This is why he had to, when he's writing these epistles, it sounds like he's kind of going back and forth, going in circles. Because when you're under a governorship, especially those that were constantly, killing these Jews, you know, and even when they were offering up the sacrifice at the temple, and that account is in Luke, but not to stray off from the subject. The point here being is that Paul, throughout his teachings, he's also sliding prophecies into precepts also. So you can distinguish the difference between these Gentiles, these Israelite foreigners, and these heathens of these other nations. So this wasn't written as a means just to show us, but it was written for back then, because you couldn't openly, have these things published and letters sent, you know, if you weren't writing it in a covert manner, because again, all these things weren't given for everybody. So this is why Paul had to write these things in a way to where they had to be deciphered. You had to have a certain base of knowledge and a certain understanding to read these epistles, these letters back then, and understand what it was talking about. So not only was Paul, he was attempting to build up these Israelite foreigners with these prophecies, with constantly quoting the law, the prophets, but also he was confirming the things that he already had learned in the law and the prophets and the revelations given to him through the teachings of Yahushua that he taught to the disciples and the elders at Jerusalem, and those who had witnessed Yahushua in his ministry and the things that Paul learned. And throughout time, he things were revealed as far as the understanding to how all these things were connected, as far as prophecy, the these Israelite foreigners, ultimately how they were commanded to return back into the fold according to prophecy, and to the things that Yahushua Mashiach taught. So again, Genesis 22:17, that's a transitional prophecy, because again it says, and thy seed shall possess the gate of his enemies. And that's also a transitional prophecy, because that hasn't been completely fulfilled. Because if you see in verse 18, it says, and in thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. Even when you read, I believe, Salakia. In Genesis chapter 15, now I'm not going to go into it, but, when the Most High promised the land of Canaan to Abraham, I think it's in right here, chapter 12. This book of Genesis, chapter 12 and verse 7. The Lord appeared unto Abraham and said, unto thy seed will I give this land. And there builded he an altar unto the Lord who appeared unto him. So while Abraham was still alive, he never actually received the inheritance of the land, but that was promised to his seed. Same with Genesis chapter 22. This is why the gospel, the good tidings, this is why Paul uses that example that it was preached to Abraham, because he was told all these things, and even Moses, these things were revealed to him, but were hidden until a certain dispensation time to be revealed to those under these Romans and these Greeks, and ultimately now through the power of Spirit Yahweh Bashim Yahushai. So now Genesis chapter 22 verse 17, that's a transitional prophecy, because it says, and thy seed shall possess the gate of his enemies, and thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. Same thing that you read in Galatians chapter 3 and verse 8, the scripture foreseeing that God would justify the heathen being these Israelite foreigners through faith, because they were of that same faith of Abraham. Like it says in verse 9, and these are those same seed and lineage of people that came from Abraham, to which Abraham and his seed were given the promises. So this is how you distinguish when it's talking about these Gentiles, which are Israelites, which are of the seed of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And when he says, and preached before the gospel unto Abraham. So these are the good news, the good tidings, the future prophecies that are to come to pass. Things that are written in the heavens and are being played out at a certain dispensation of time. And it says in verse 8, saying, in thee shall all nations be blessed. So this is Paul, throwing these hints in there, building up these Jews who were already learned, and also building up these Israelite foreigners coming back into the fold. So these things couldn't be written plainly because, again, you got to remember, they were under the servitude of these Romans. So he couldn't just go out and say, these other, Paul's, writing the letter, well, these other nations are going to get destroyed, and, it couldn't have went down like that. So it had to be communicated, these things, in a manner to when those who could receive it, they received it, and those who weren't well taught, they were built up through these letters and through the teachings that Paul did throughout his visits. So now let's go back to Salakia. I kind of went off subject. But now let's go back to chapter 4 and verse 2. But is under tutors and governors until the time appointed of the Father. So the nation of Israel being in a early stage, tutors and governors being the law and the prophets. Even so, when we were children, were in bondage under the elements of the world. So verses 5 through 7 is speaking on these Gentiles, these Israelite foreigners, like he touched on in the previous chapter. Those who came with the seed of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who originated through the promise given to Abraham. So these are these heirs and those that were adopted. It's not speaking on everybody just being adopted in. This is why you have to go not just line upon line, but here a little, there a little. Because it'll tell you in the book of Romans also that it'll give you like a chronology, and it'll give you similitudes, so you can get the understanding of who these Israelite foreigners are. So now verses 9 through 11 is speaking on these Israelite foreigners, who again, they were assimilated into Greek-Roman society. And in verse 10, after coming back into the knowledge of their customs and practices, you had like I brought out in the first two videos, you had Jews, proselytes going around and attempting to convert these Gentiles, but were immediately commanding them to keep the law and to circumcise themselves without building them up properly, as far as the precepts and the law and the examples given by the prophets. So they were being brought back into the fold, but they weren't being built up in the correct manner. And these people were those that weren't brought up under the teachings of the apostles and the elders. They were going about on their own. This is why Yahushua Hamashiach, he said in the book of John, it's not my doctrine, but the doctrine of the Heavenly Father. So that's how you know the spirit of truth and the spirit of error, when all things line up. So now let's go back to verse 16. Am I therefore become your enemy because I tell you the truth? Verse 17. They zealously affect you, but not well. Yet they would exclude you that you might affect them. So again, you had these rulers of the Jews who were not only practicing hypocrisy, but they neglected their Israelite counterparts, their foreign, these Gentiles, these Israelite foreigners. So now let me bring out another precept for verse 17. Well, let me read it. Slakia. Galatians Chapter 4 and 17. They zealously affect you, but not well. Yeah, they would exclude you that you might affect them. So now let's go to the book of Luke Chapter 9 and verse 22. This is the book of Luke Chapter 9 and verse 22. And it reads, actually, Salakia. Salakia, I think. I believe it was John. Salakia, bear with me. Khan. This book of John, chapter 9, and I'll start at verse 1. And Yahushua, as Yahushua passed by, he saw a man which was blind from his birth. And his disciples asked him, saying, Master, who did sin, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Verse 3, Yahushua answered, Neither hath this man sinned, nor his parents, but that the works of God should be made manifest in him. Now, if you look into the account, Yahushua, he put clay in this man's eyes to anoint him and to heal him from his blindness. Now, let's go down to I'll start at verse 20. Verse 19, And they asked them, saying, Is this your son, whom ye say was born blind? How then doth he now see? So this is the Jews, approaching the parents of the blind man who was healed. And the parents ultimately said, to ask him, because they weren't there, so they weren't going to speak on that, since they weren't there when Yahushua healed him. And also they feared the Jews, because let's read on. They feared, as far as even answering them anything. So they were being very careful with their words. Verse 19, And they asked him, saying, Is this your son, who ye say was born blind? How then doth he now see? Verse 20, His parents answered them and said, We know that this is our son, and that he was born blind. Verse 21, But by what means he now seeth, we know not, or who hath opened his eyes, we know not. He is of age, ask him, he shall speak for himself. Verse 22, These words spake his parents, because they feared the Jews. For the Jews had agreed already that if any man did confess that he was a Mashiach, he should be put out of the synagogue. So this is whom Paul was speaking on. Those that those that exclude you, so that you might, these Jews were excluding, people like this who were believing in the truth that Yahushua was teaching. So they were excluding them so that they might gain favor from them by excluding them, or have things go their way, the way they wanted it, which was hypocrisy. So now let's see if I can get another preset. So bear with me. I believe it's in the book of Matthew. Slack, bear with me. For sure it's in Matthew. This is the book of Matthew chapter 9 and verse 9. And it reads, Shalakia. And as Yahushua passed from thence, he saw a man named Matthew, sitting at the receipt of custom. And he saith unto him, Follow me. And he arose and followed him. And it came to pass that Yahushua sat at meat in the house. Behold, many publicans and sinners came and sat down with him and his disciples. Verse 11, And when the Pharisees saw it, they said unto his disciples, Why eateth your master with publicans and sinners? So these publicans were essentially tax collectors, and the sinners were those that the Jews considered, sinful, depraved, those who weren't according to their, to their measure. They weren't keeping everything to a T, nor, following their lead as far as, the things that these Pharisees and these rulers of these Jews were doing. So they considered this is why they were called sinners. You go into the Greek, it's hamartolos. So they looked at them as filth, and they called them that, just because they were even the tax collectors, they looked down on them too, and they were of their own people. Even this is why Cornelius was considered a Gentile. He kept the commandments. It said that he was a devout man. But these Jews consider him a Gentile because, one, he participated in the Roman army, and two, he wasn't practicing Jewry according to the measure of what these Jews considered, the correct way, to keep the laws, which is, according to them, was the laws and also these traditions that they were building upon men. Like it says in Matthew, they were putting grievous burdens on them. So they were telling them to keep the law, but they were also Salakia, but they were also, adding their own traditions, their own twist, to the things in the law, and they were essentially adding to the law with their traditions. Washing the cups, the Corbin law, things of that sort. So this is why, there wasn't no profit in keeping a law, you know, according to, not just what they taught, but Yahweh Shai said, do as they say, but not as they do. So Yahweh Shai said, keep the law, but don't follow the ways of their hypocrisies. You see that? So now let me see if I can get another precept about the grievous burdens. Shalakia. This book of Matthew, chapter 23. And let me see if I can go to, I'll start at verse 2. Verse 1. Then spake Yahweh Shai to the multitude and to his disciples, saying, the scribes and Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. All therefore whatsoever they bid you observe, that observe and do, but do not ye after their works, for they say and do not. Verse 4. For they bind heavy burdens and grievous to be borne, and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers. But all their works they do for to be seen of men. They make broad their phylacteries and enlarge the borders of their garments. So again, these men wanted the glory, but they weren't teaching the foundation. This is why Yahushai he had to come in and magnify the law and teach the correct measure and execution of the law. So again, these are the works that these Jews were doing. This is why Paul was saying, they exclude you so they may affect them, and by that it means they'll exclude you so they can get you to have it their way. But again, Yahushua Mashiach said, do as they say, but not as they do. And also, they were calling these publicans sinners, and they were going off through that too. The publicans and the sinners, they looked down on them just because they weren't keeping, Jewry to a T. So now let's go back to Galatians. Shalakia. Chapter 3. Salakia. And verse 4 and verse 18. Chapter 4, verse 18. But it is good to be zealously affected always in a good thing, and not only when I am present with you. Verse 19. My little children, of whom I travail in birth, again until Hamashiach be formed in you. So again, this is why in this chapter he's using the similitude of a child, because not only the nation of Israel was in an early stage after they immediately left Egypt and were given the commandments at that appointed time, but he's also speaking at this dispensation time when these Jews and these Israelite foreigners were commanded to return back into the fold. So now, this is why he's using that type of wording. So Yahushai, is the Paul wasn't literally in birth with children, but he was using the same terminology that you read in the prophets and also in Revelations. So let's go to that real quick. In the Book of Revelations, chapter 11, and verse, I believe it's 13. Salakia. Salakia, bear with me. See if I can find that precept real quick. Actually, verse 5 in chapter 12, Revelations. Revelations chapter 12 and verse 5. I'll start at verse 4. And his tail drew the third part of the stars of heaven, and did cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman which was ready to be delivered, for to devour her child as soon as it was born. So that child being Yahushai Mashiach, and the woman being a representation of the nation of Israel, being in labor with that child. And Paul's using that same similitude, because it was also written in the prophets. But just for time's sake, I'm just going to bring out this precept just to show the comparison that he was making, even with Revelations. Verse 5, and she brought forth a man-child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up unto God and to his throne. So ultimately, it's talking about Yahushai, when he was caught up to the third heavens. But the man-child, that's Yahushai, who was to rule all nations, and that's also a transitional prophecy, because that already happened. He was brought up, he was delivered, but also this is twofold. This is why Paul said that he travails in birth with those of these churches, until Christ is formed in them. Now that's the same similitude used here in Revelations chapter 12. Paul, he's saying he's travailing with them until Hamashiach is formed in them. As far as the through the dispensation of time, the nation of Israel being built up, and that was starting, like he said in verse 1, Galatians chapter 4, as a child. And the child is in the early stages that was representing the nation when they were given the law. Now he's speaking in verse 19, Galatians 4:19, at the dispensation time of the Greeks and the Romans, when these practicing Jews and these Israelite foreigners were, through the Great Commission, commanded to come back to their former customs and covenants. Now this was Hamashiach being formed in them, because he was uniting these two groups together, as far as through the things that he taught in his ministry. Now let's go to Galatians chapter 4 and verse 20. And it reads, I desire to be present with you now, and to change my voice, for I stand in doubt of you. Verse 21, tell me that ye desire to be under the law, do ye not hear the law? Now, this is verse 22, for it is written that Abraham had two sons, the one by a bondmaid, the other by a free woman. So now you have to understand that Paul uses examples from the law, but you can't take them literal. Now they are literal as far as what was written and the account, because Abraham did actually have two sons, the bondmaid of the bondmaid and the free woman. Now that is an actual count, but Paul is using this as an example of the comparisons of the law and the transition into the new covenant, as far as the promises and things that still have to come to pass, you know, and the things that weren't weren't you weren't justified before, but through Mashiach Yahushai, you know, he's making those two comparisons. So he's telling these Galatians, and I'll read on, but not to rely on just the works of the law, because that's not what it goes back to. It goes back to the promises and all the things that had to go down after that. So now let's go back to verse 9. But now after that ye have known God, or rather known of God, have turned ye again to the weak and beggarly elements, whereunto you desire again to be in bondage. So this Paul was telling these Jews and these Gentiles, you've been, brought back into the fold. You're being revealed these things, as far as, the Jews, they're getting that understanding on the law and the prophets, and how these Israelite foreigners are justified in returning to their covenant, to their former covenants. And also these Israelite foreigners, they had went off and practicing the customs of the heathens of these other nations, but now in this time are commanded to return back to the fold. But Paul's telling, especially these Gentiles, look, you have, of course, you got to keep the law, but don't go into the same practices of following what the rulers of the Jews were doing. Because if you just go back to that, then you're just going back to follow their ways of hypocrisy, and the law is not going to benefit you, because you're just gonna perpetrate the same things that they were perpetrating. This is why Yahushua Mashiach, he gave a certain direction, and he spoke of the law, and he spoke on certain matters of the law, because he had to not just magnify the law, but show the proper works and the proper execution of the law. Now is Galatians chapter 4 and verse 23. And it reads, But he who was of the bondwoman was born after the flesh, but he of the free woman was by promise. Verse 24. Which things are an allegory, for these are the two covenants, the one from the Mount Sinai, which gendereth to bondage, which is Agar. Now, if you go back to verse 3, the similitude that Paul is using is bondage under the elements of the world, is going back to the essentially the carnal works of the law, and thinking that you're justified in that alone, which is what these Jews, they thought they were justified in that alone, and they were so caught up in the traditions and their customs, they didn't receive the what Yahushai and his purpose was when he came on the scene, to reprove them of their hypocrisy, but also to let them know, look, you have these Israelite foreigners, and they're commanded to come back into the fold. And through the things that he taught, this is how these Jews and these Gentiles were being built up, through the revelations that the apostles received, and the Jews learning from that, and the things that Paul and the apostles were teaching to these Israelite foreigners, and returning, keeping the the laws and the customs, but also with that faith that they believed in the remission of sins, and also in their justification in returning, and not being outcasted by their counterparts, the Jews. So now let's read on to verse 25. For this Agar is Mount Sinai in Arabia, and answereth to Jerusalem, which now is, and is in bondage with her children. So again, this is why you have to read the whole chapter to get the proper understanding. Because again, this is an actual account, but Paul is using it as an example to teach the carnal works of the law compared with the spiritual works of the law, or the things that are justifiable, but they don't pertain to what these Jews in the ruling class were perpetrating, which was nothing but hypocrisy. And verse 26, it reads, But Jerusalem, which is above, is free, which is the mother of us all. Verse 27, For it is written, Rejoice, thou barren that bearest not. Break forth and cry, thou that travailest not. For the desolate hath many more children than she which hath a husband. Verse 28, Now we brethren, as Isaac was, are the children of promise. So again, the main subject here is the promises given to the seed, starting with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's the main purpose and the main subject that he's bringing up to these Galatians, to show them, look, the law is not the end all be all, but was given just as the promise was given, and then the law through the dispensation of time. So the Jews were more or less they were stuck on the law and the dispensation of that time. These Jews and the ruling class, and they neglected things that came after the law, as far as these Israelite foreigners coming back into the fold, and the things that Yahushua Mashiach taught, because he taught the proper execution of the law, and also as far and he spoke on the end time prophecies. Same with the book of Revelation. All these things go hand in hand. But speaking on only the things that happened during the Romans and the Greeks, this is why Paul's going back to the promise. He's saying you got to start there, and then the law is good. You should keep it, but you have to be built up in the right way and following the right things, which is what Yahushua Mashiach came to do. Verse 29. But as then he that was born after the flesh persecuted him that was born after the spirit, even so it is now. Verse 30. Nevertheless, what saith the scripture? Cast out the bondwoman and her son, for the son of the bondwoman shall not be heir with the son of the free woman. Now let me get a precept. Let me see. Genesis chapter 21 and verse 10. And it reads, Salakia. See, it's trying to hinder the word. And another point being, let me me just bring out this precept. Genesis chapter 21 and verse 10. And it reads, Wherefore she said unto Abraham, Cast out this bondwoman and her son, for the son of this bondwoman shall not be heir with my son, even with Isaac. Or, yeah, that's the precept I was getting. So again, this is an actual account, and this actually, Paul was actually teaching in a twofold manner, because not only does this account, when he brings it up in this epistle, is going to um, basically, get those who read the epistles, as far as the Jews and these Gentiles, he's getting them to kind of, spark their thinking, to get them to look into that account, and look back into the early accounts, and to see how they are justified, and also to be built up in the proper way. So this is why, Paul was teaching that just following the law to a T is not what justifies you, but being built up in the proper manner through the law, through the examples given in the prophets, and also Yahweh Shai Mashiach. So it's Galatians 5 and 18. So I can't bear with me. But if ye be led of the Spirit, you are not under the law. So that's speaking on not just being under the carnal works of the law, but the spiritual things, which lead your moral compass. This is why keeping the law is not only is the law perfect, but keeping the law is profitable, because you're being constantly directed. When you're constantly meditating on the precepts, you're leading your works through your faith, and that's through your heart, which is your mind. And these things Yahweh Shai Mashiach taught, and those things are manifest through your actions, your thoughts, and those things are start in the inward. So again, this is why Paul doesn't teach against the law, but he teaches that there's certain aspects that you have to be built up in, and not just keeping the law to a T. And certain understanding. This is why he constantly is bringing out the examples, and bringing out the not just things in the law, but the prophets. It's Galatians chapter 4 verse 31, and it reads, So then, brethren, we are not children of the bondwoman, but of the free. So again, the point being is, Paul is telling these Galatians, look, you're already built up in a good way through the understanding that we're giving you. Don't go back to just doing what the rulers of the Jews are doing, which is making it seem like they're following the law by following it to a T, but at the same time being hypocrites and essentially breaking the law. Like it says in chapter 3, chapter 2 and verse 18. Building up, destroying the same things that they were building up, making themselves a transgressor, by despising those Gentiles, by excluding them, from the synagogues and so on and so forth. So let me just get that precept. Galatians chapter 2 and verse 18. For if I build again the things which I destroyed, I make myself a transgressor. So again, this is what Paul is constantly writing to these Galatians in this epistle. That's a constant theme. Not just relying on keeping the law to a T, but being built up on the principles that the law teaches. Because if you're not built up in the principles, then you're gonna do the same thing as these Jews, just keeping, observing days, you know, fasting, giving alms, but you're not showing your righteous works. You're actually being, you're going against the things that you're teaching and teaching people to keep. Because again, the law says you shouldn't, hold a grudge against your own people. But people, you know, especially our people, we love to hold grudges. So-called Black, Hispanic, Native Americans. We're stiff-necked, like the Most High said. Is a stiff-necked people. But so this Galatians chapter 4 breakdown. Hear, O Israel, giving honor and glory to Yahweh Ba'ashem Yahushai. I'm gonna say Shalom.